My name's Mark, and until recently, I thought I had a solid marriage. Helen and I have been together for 8 years, married for 5. We were one of those couples people envied. Adventurous, always laughing, the kind of relationship that felt indestructible. Or so I thought. Looking back, maybe I should have seen the signs. It's easy to connect the dots when the picture's already drawn. For years, Helen had a knack for making me feel like the luckiest man alive. She was sharp, funny, and had this infectious energy that drew people to her like moths to a flame. But lately, things started to feel off. Subtle changes that at first I chalked up to stress or bad timing. It started about 3 months ago. Helen became distant, checking her phone constantly, stepping outside to take calls, and getting defensive when I asked who she was talking to. She claimed work was overwhelming, her boss a nightmare, and I believed her. Why wouldn't I? I knew she was ambitious, always aiming to climb higher in her marketing firm. It made sense, at least on the surface. But then there were the late nights. Helen never used to be the type to work overtime, let alone get dressed up for it. She'd leave the house looking like she was heading to a cocktail party instead of a marketing meeting. I joked about it once, teasing her about stealing the show, but she snapped at me. "Not everything's about you, Mark," she said, her tone sharper than I'd ever heard before. That night, I lay awake replaying her words in my head. Something didn't add up. Helen had always been open, almost to a fault. Yet here she was, guarding her phone like it held the nuclear codes. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The real turning point came 2 weeks ago. Out of nowhere, Helen announced she needed a solo getaway, a mental health break, to figure some things out. She insisted it wasn't about us, that she just needed time to clear her head. "You're always so understanding," she said, flashing that radiant smile that used to melt me. But this time, it felt calculated, like she was trying too hard to convince me. I tried to be supportive, I really did. I asked if there was anything she wanted to talk about, anything I could do to help. She waved me off, telling me not to worry. "I'll come back refreshed, and we'll be better than ever," she promised. But the words felt hollow, rehearsed. Something in my gut told me to dig deeper. So, when she left for her getaway, I did something I never thought I'd do. I tracked her. A friend of mine, Daniel, works in IT and helped me set up a tracking app on her phone weeks earlier when I started having doubts. I'd never used it before. It felt wrong, invasive. But this time, I needed answers. What I found shattered me. Helen wasn't at the spa retreat she'd mentioned. Instead, the tracker pinged her at a secluded Airbnb 2 towns over. My heart sank. I spent the night pacing, my mind spinning with possibilities, hoping, praying. There was a reasonable explanation. But the next morning, curiosity got the better of me. I drove to the address, my stomach in knots the entire way. What I found when I arrived, well, let's just say that's a story for the next post. I need a moment to catch my breath just thinking about it. When I pulled up to the Airbnb, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely shut off the car. The place was small, nestled at the edge of a wooded area, the kind of romantic hideaway you'd book for an anniversary or a proposal. My chest tightened just looking at it. Helen had always loved places like this, cozy, secluded, with a touch of rustic charm. She used to daydream about us retiring to a cabin in the woods someday. And now, here she was, without me. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to steady my breathing. Part of me wanted to turn around, to preserve some shred of ignorance. But another part, the part that couldn't stand not knowing, forced me to get out. I walked up the gravel path, each step crunching louder than it should have in the still morning air. My heart pounded as I reached the door. Through the front window, I saw them. Helen and a man I didn't recognize sitting by the fireplace. She was leaning toward him, her legs tucked beneath her, holding a glass of red wine. They were laughing, and the way she looked at him, I hadn't seen her look at me like that in years. The man, James, I'd learn his name soon enough, was tall, with that effortlessly charming look some guys just have. Casual, confident, like he owned the room without even trying. He was pouring more wine into Helen's glass, his hand brushing hers as he set the bottle down. The intimacy was unmistakable. For a moment, I froze. My mind screamed at me to do something. Bang on the door, burst in, demand answers, but my body wouldn't move. Instead, I stood there, staring, my breath fogging up the glass as I tried to process what I was seeing. Eventually, the anger took over. I slammed my fist on the door, the sound reverberating through the quiet forest. Inside, Helen jumped, nearly spilling her wine. Her face paled as she turned toward the window and saw me standing there. "Mark," she said, her voice muffled through the door. She scrambled to her feet, looking like a deer caught in headlights. James stood too, a look of confusion and maybe a little fear crossing his face. I didn't wait for her to open the door. I twisted the knob and stepped inside, the heat from the fireplace hitting me like a wall. Helen's eyes darted between me and James, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for an explanation. "What the hell is this, Helen?" I said, my voice louder than I intended. "A solo getaway, huh? Looks pretty cozy for one." "It's not what it looks like," she stammered, stepping toward me. "James is just a friend. We were catching up, that's all." "Catching up?" I scoffed, gesturing to the wine and the intimate setup. "With wine, a fire, and God knows what else? Do you take me for an idiot?" James cleared his throat, raising his hands like he was trying to defuse a bomb. "Look, man, I didn't know she was married," Helen said. "Don't," I snapped, cutting him off. "Don't you dare try to pin this on me." I turned back to Helen, who was already switching tactics. Her face hardened, her voice taking on that condescending tone she used when she wanted to shut down a conversation. "Mark, you're overreacting. Nothing happened. I needed a break, and James was just—" "Spare me the lies," I interrupted. "How long has this been going on? How many other friends have there been?" Her silence told me everything I needed to know. She crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing like I was the one in the wrong. "Maybe if you weren't so distant, I wouldn't have to find someone else to talk to." There it was, the shift from denial to blame. Classic Helen. I could feel the blood rushing to my ears, my fists clenching at my sides. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice shaking. "You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around behind my back, and now it's my fault?" James, to his credit, looked genuinely uncomfortable. He stepped away from Helen, putting distance between them like he didn't want to be part of this anymore. "I didn't know about you, man," he said quietly. "She told me you were separated, that things were already over." "Get out," I snapped, glaring at him. "Now." He hesitated, glancing at Helen, but when she didn't say anything, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "I'm sorry," he muttered as he passed me. I didn't respond. My focus was entirely on Helen. When the door closed behind him, the room fell silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, its warmth doing nothing to thaw the icy tension between us. "You've got some nerve," I said finally, my voice low, "dragging me through the mud to justify your affair. Did you even think about what this would do to me? To us?" Helen rolled her eyes, her expression defiant. "Oh, please, Mark. Don't act like you're some perfect victim. Our marriage has been a joke for years, and you know it." Her words hit like a slap. I wanted to yell, to lash out, but instead, I turned and walked toward the door. "You've made your choice, Helen. Don't expect me to stick around to clean up your mess." As I stepped outside into the cold morning air, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. I didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. This was just the beginning. I drove home in silence, my mind spinning with what I'd just witnessed. The anger sat like a stone in my chest, heavy and unrelenting. But it wasn't the only thing. Beneath the rage was something colder, a grim determination. Helen thought she could manipulate me, rewrite our history to justify her betrayal, but she was about to learn otherwise. When I walked through the door, the house felt eerily still. Everything was exactly as we'd left it before her solo getaway. The blanket she always threw on the couch, the coffee mug she'd forgotten on the counter. It was like her lies had seeped into every corner of our home, tainting the life we'd built together. I grabbed a drink and sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. My hands hovered over the screen for a moment before I opened my messages and scrolled to Daniel. If anyone could help me turn this mess into leverage, it was him. Me. "Hey man, Need a favor. Can we meet? Daniel. Sure. Everything okay? Me. Not even close. I'll explain when I see you. We met later that day at a quiet coffee shop, a spot we'd used for countless hangouts over the years. Daniel was already there when I arrived, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with concern. All right, what's going on? He asked as I sat down. I didn't sugarcoat it. I laid everything out, the tracker, the Airbnb, Helen's lies, and the smug asshole she'd been with. By the time I finished, Daniel's expression had hardened. Damn, Mark, he said, leaning back in his chair. That's rough. You sure about what you saw? I'm sure, I said firmly. And I need proof. Something solid. So she can't twist this around when it all comes crashing down? Daniel nodded, his mind already working. We can pull some data. Messages, emails, even photos if she's dumb enough to save them. You still have access to her devices? Yeah, I said, my jaw tightening. Helen's phone passcode hadn't changed in years, and her laptop was synced to our shared account. It hadn't seemed significant before, but now it felt like a lifeline. Good. Give me her login info, and I'll see what I can dig up, Daniel said. But Mark, he hesitated, his gaze serious. You need to be ready for what you might find. This could get ugly. It's already ugly, I replied. I just need the truth, no matter how bad it is. That night, Daniel started digging while I stayed up pacing the living room. My mind replayed the confrontation at the Airbnb over and over. Helen's smug expression burned into my memory. Every time I thought about her blaming me for her affair, the anger flared up again, hotter and more focused. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. Daniel, got some stuff? Call me. I didn't hesitate. What did you find? I asked as soon as he answered. Texts mostly, he said. Between her and this James guy. Looks like they've been at it for months. I forwarded them to you. When the notifications came through, I opened the messages with trembling hands. There it was, laid out in black and white. Helen and James had been texting constantly, flirty, intimate, and increasingly explicit as the weeks went on. She'd even sent him photos of the two of them at the Airbnb, the kind of couple shots we used to take during happier times. But the worst part? Her texts about me. He's so oblivious, it's almost sad. I don't think he'd notice if I walked out tomorrow. Mark's always been emotionally distant. This isn't a real marriage anymore. I don't even feel guilty. I deserve to be happy. Every word was like a punch to the gut. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the messages, the evidence piling up with every swipe. She'd painted me as some neglectful husband, using our struggles as a smokescreen for her affair. I saved everything. Screenshots, emails, even the metadata from the photos to prove when and where they were taken. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to destroy whatever story she thought she could spin. I spent the rest of the night drafting my next moves. The first step was clear. She wasn't walking back into this house like nothing had happened. The locks were getting changed first thing in the morning. I didn't care what excuses Helen would come up with or how many crocodile tears she'd try to shed. She'd made her choices. Now it was time for her to face the consequences. As I sat there in the dark, staring at the pile of evidence on my laptop, one thought kept running through my mind. She didn't just betray me. She underestimated me. And that was her biggest mistake. Helen came home 2 days later, completely unaware of the storm waiting for her. I sat in the living room, laptop on the coffee table, my phone buzzing every few minutes with notifications. The house felt colder, emptier, even with her suitcase thudding against the floor as she walked through the door. She froze when she saw me, her smile fading. Mark, what are you doing sitting in the dark? Waiting for you, I said flatly, barely glancing up. The air between us was thick with tension. Helen tilted her head, trying to act casual, but I saw the flicker of unease cross her face. Well, I'm back, she said, forcing a smile. What's with the serious vibe? Sit down, Helen. My voice was cold, steady. We need to talk. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the laptop on the table. What's going on? I said sit, I repeated, the edge in my tone cutting through her attempt at feigned innocence. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the edge of the couch, her posture rigid. I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. I know about James. The texts, the photos, the Airbnb, everything. Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it. But then, in classic Helen fashion, she pivoted. "You've been spying on me," she snapped, her tone dripping with indignation. "What the hell, Mark? That's an invasion of privacy." I scoffed, shaking my head. "That's your defense? Not that you didn't do it, but that I caught you. Unbelievable." Her mouth opened, then closed, her jaw tightening. "This is ridiculous," she said, crossing her arms. "James is just a friend. I needed someone to talk to, and you've been so checked out lately." I laughed bitterly, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "A friend? You call sneaking off to a romantic getaway, sending flirty texts, and trashing me behind my back friendship? You must think I'm an idiot." "Mark, nothing happened," she said, her voice climbing. "You're blowing this way out of proportion." "Really?" I grabbed my laptop and opened the folder Daniel had helped me compile. "Then explain this." I turned the screen toward her, displaying screenshots of her messages with James. The texts, the explicit photos, the timestamps proving it all. Her eyes widened as she scanned the screen, her face turning red. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You went through my phone?" "You bet I did," I said, my anger simmering just below the surface. "And I found exactly what I expected, proof of how little our marriage meant to you." Helen's expression shifted, her defensive mask cracking. For the first time, she looked genuinely nervous. "Okay, yes, I was talking to James," she admitted, her tone softening. "But it wasn't serious. It was just flirting." "Flirting?" I repeated, my voice rising. "That's what you call telling him our marriage is over? That I'm distant and oblivious? Sending him photos of you two together? Don't insult me, Helen." Her shoulders slumped, but then, in a move so characteristic of her, she flipped the script. "Maybe if you'd been more present, I wouldn't have needed to talk to someone else," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "Do you have any idea how lonely I've been, Mark?" "Lonely?" I repeated, my voice a dangerous growl. "You were lonely while I was working to support us? While I was trying to make things better between us, and you were sneaking around with some guy behind my back?" She stood abruptly, glaring down at me. "You know what? You're not perfect, Mark. You're cold, distant, and half the time. It feels like I'm married to a stranger. Maybe if you'd put as much effort into this marriage as you did into your work, we wouldn't be here." Her words hit like a punch to the gut, but they didn't break me. I stood, towering over her, my fists clenched at my sides. "Don't you dare try to turn this on me," I said, my voice shaking with controlled fury. "You made your choice, Helen. You decided lying and cheating were easier than facing our problems like an adult." She stared at me, her expression unreadable, before letting out a bitter laugh. "Fine," she said, throwing up her hands. "You want me to be the villain? Fine, I'll be the villain. But don't pretend you're some perfect victim." I didn't respond. I walked to the front door and opened it. "Your things are in the garage," I said coldly. "The locks are changed, and I'll have divorce papers drawn up by the end of the week. Don't bother trying to spin this, Helen. I've got enough evidence to bury any story you come up with." For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me like she couldn't believe this was happening. Then she grabbed her purse and stormed past me, slamming the door on her way out. As the sound echoed through the house, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, relief. The confrontation was over, but the fight wasn't. Helen thought she could rewrite history, turn herself into the victim of our story. But I wasn't about to let her get away with it. The first few days after Helen left felt like living in the aftermath of a hurricane. The house was quiet, unnervingly so, but it wasn't a peaceful kind of silence. It was heavy, like the walls were holding their breath, waiting for what came next. I spent the time methodically cleaning out every trace of her. Her clothes, her toiletries, the photos of us smiling like we had it all figured out. It all went into boxes, which I shoved into the garage. By the time I was done, the house looked stark, like a shell of what it used to be. But that felt right. Our marriage had been a shell for a long time, and I'd just been too blind to see it. On the third day, Helen called. I stared at her name flashing on my screen, debating whether to answer. Part of me wanted to hear what she had to say, to see if she'd finally own up to her betrayal. But the other part, the louder part, was done listening to her excuses. I let it ring. A minute later, my phone buzzed with a text. "Mark, we need to talk. Please, just give me a chance to explain." Explain? She'd done plenty of explaining during our confrontation, and every word had been a lie or an excuse. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on preparing for what came next. I called Helen's parents first. They'd always been kind to me, and I figured they deserved to hear the truth from me before Helen started spinning her version of events. Her mother, Linda, picked up on the second ring. "Mark, it's so good to hear from you. How's Helen's little getaway going?" I took a deep breath. "Linda, I need to tell you something. It's about Helen, and it's not good." By the time I finished explaining, there was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice shaky. "I can't believe this," she said. "She never mentioned." "I'm so sorry, Mark. You don't deserve this." "I just thought you should know," I said. "I'm filing for divorce, and I wanted to be upfront with you before things get messy." Linda promised to speak with Helen, but I could tell she was as blindsided as I had been. I hung up feeling a small sense of vindication. Helen's web of lies was starting to unravel, and I wasn't about to let her patch it back together. The next call I made was to my lawyer, Helen Collins. She was known for being ruthless in court, and I needed someone who wouldn't let Helen twist this into something it wasn't. I laid everything out for her: the texts, the photos, the confrontation. By the end of our conversation, she was already drafting the paperwork. "Do you want to push for fault-based divorce?" Helen asked. "Absolutely," I said. "She deserves to be held accountable for what she's done." "Good," she replied. "With the evidence you've provided, we'll have a solid case. I'll make sure she doesn't walk away with a cent more than she's entitled to." Hearing her confidence was like a balm. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had control over something. Helen might have blindsided me, but now the ball was in my court. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. Helen tried calling and texting several more times, but I ignored her. She left a voicemail once, her voice trembling as she pleaded with me to meet her, just to talk. I didn't even listen to the whole thing. Whatever she had to say, it didn't matter. She made her choices. Now she could live with them. By the time the divorce papers were ready, I felt like I was walking into battle. I handed them to a process server, who assured me Helen would receive them within the next 48 hours. I couldn't help but wonder how she'd react. Would she cry? Rage? Try to manipulate me into reconsidering? Whatever it was, I was ready. Meanwhile, the fallout from our confrontation at the house started to ripple through our social circle. Word traveled fast, and it wasn't long before mutual friends were reaching out to me, asking what had happened. At first, I kept the details vague, but when I heard that Helen was already trying to paint me as controlling and emotionally unavailable, I decided enough was enough. I sent a group message to our closest friends, attaching a few of the more damning texts between Helen and James. My message was simple: "This is the truth. Do with it what you will." The responses came quickly, and they were overwhelmingly supportive. "Jesus, Mark. I'm so sorry. She's disgusting for what she did. If you need anything, I'm here. I had no idea. You deserve so much better." A few people, clearly still in Helen's corner, stayed silent. I figured that was their choice, but I wasn't about to let her narrative go unchallenged. By the end of the week, I felt like a different man. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but it wasn't consuming me anymore. I had a plan, a direction, and people in my corner who believed in me. Helen had underestimated me, but now she was beginning to see the truth. She thought she could lie, manipulate, and walk away unscathed. She was wrong. This was only the beginning of her reckoning. Helen received the divorce papers on a rainy Wednesday afternoon. I knew the exact moment because my phone lit up with an incoming call from her. I ignored it. Then another, and another. After the fifth attempt, she left a voicemail, her voice a mix of panic and frustration. "Mark, are you serious? Divorce? You're really going to throw away everything we've built over a misunderstanding? Call me. We need to talk. A misunderstanding. That's what she called months of lies, sneaking around, and an emotional affair that spiraled into a full-blown betrayal. I deleted the voicemail and got back to work. If she wanted to talk, she could do it through my lawyer. But Helen didn't stop there. Over the next few days, she escalated. First, there were the texts, dozens of them, alternating between anger and desperation. You're being unreasonable. Mark, please, let's work this out. We can fix this. How dare you involve my parents? That was completely out of line. Don't do this. You'll regret it. When I didn't respond, she switched tactics. Mutual friends started reaching out, clearly parroting whatever sob story she'd spun for them. Hey man, one of them, Kyle, said during a call. Helen's been telling us you're blowing this out of proportion. She swears it wasn't as bad as it looks. Maybe you guys should sit down and talk? I bit back a sharp response, opting instead for calm clarity. Kyle, I sent you the screenshots. You've seen the proof. If you still think there's something to talk about, that's on you. But I'm done. He hesitated, then muttered, Yeah, I get it. Sorry, man. Click. Helen wasn't getting the sympathy she'd hoped for. People were starting to see through her facade, and it clearly rattled her. By the end of the week, she showed up at the house. I was in the kitchen when I heard the knock. Through the window, I saw her standing on the porch, her hair damp from the rain, a defeated look on her face. I considered ignoring her, but something made me open the door. Maybe curiosity, maybe the need for closure. Mark, she said softly, her voice breaking as she stepped forward. Can I come in? I held my ground, blocking the doorway. Say what you need to say, and then leave. Her lip quivered, and for a moment, I almost felt bad. Almost. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I messed up. I didn't mean for it to go this far. You didn't mean for what to go this far? I asked coldly. The lies? The affair? Or the consequences? She flinched but quickly recovered. I was lonely, Mark. I didn't feel seen. And James, he was there for me in a way you weren't. I stared at her, incredulous. So your solution to feeling unseen was to lie, cheat, and trash me behind my back? You think that makes you the victim here? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face now. I'm not trying to be the victim. I'm trying to make this right. Please, Mark, don't throw away everything we've built. Her words were like a knife twisting in my gut, not because I believed them, but because I realized how far she was willing to go to manipulate me. You already threw it away, Helen, I said quietly. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. Her tears turned to anger in an instant. You're not perfect either, you know, she snapped. You've been so distant, so focused on work, and I felt like I didn't matter anymore. Do you know how hard that was for me? I let out a bitter laugh. So this is my fault now? You cheat, and I'm the problem? You're unbelievable. I didn't say that, she shouted, her voice cracking. I don't know what else to say, Mark. I love you, and I want to fix this. Her declaration hung in the air, but it felt hollow, like she was clinging to a lifeline she knew was slipping away. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before responding. Love isn't lying to someone's face, I said. Love isn't sneaking around and betraying their trust. You don't get to say you love me when you've done everything possible to destroy us. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand, cutting her off. We're done, Helen. Stop calling me, stop showing up here, and stop trying to twist this around. If you have something to say it through your lawyer. For a moment, she just stood there, the fight draining from her expression. Finally, she nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Fine, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If that's what you want. It's what you chose, I replied, stepping back and closing the door. As I leaned against the door, the sound of her footsteps fading away, I felt a wave of relief. For the first time since this nightmare started, I knew I was free. Helen's words, her tears, her anger, they were all just smoke and mirrors, desperate attempts to regain control. But she didn't control me anymore. This wasn't the end of her fallout. but it was the beginning of my healing. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, meetings with my lawyer, and strategic planning. Helen was predictably trying to claw back any sympathy she could muster, but her efforts were hitting a wall. Between the evidence I'd shared with her family and friends and her failed attempts to manipulate me, her web of lies was unraveling. It was time to make sure the final thread snapped. I'd never been one for public drama, but Helen's betrayal had changed me. I wasn't interested in vindictiveness for its own sake. I just wanted the truth out there. If Helen wanted to play the victim, I'd make sure she didn't have an audience willing to believe her. The perfect opportunity came when one of our mutual friends, Rachel, invited me to a small gathering. "Just a chill night," she'd said. "No Helen, I promise." It was the kind of reassurance I needed to hear. Rachel had been one of the few friends who stood by me from the start, refusing to buy into Helen's sob story. "You should come," she added. "People need to hear your side of things." When I arrived, the atmosphere was warm but subdued. A handful of familiar faces greeted me with cautious smiles, and I could feel the weight of their curiosity. Most of them had only heard fragments of the story, and I knew the rumors had been swirling. After a couple of drinks, Rachel took it upon herself to steer the conversation. "So, Mark," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "how are things? With, everything going on?" All eyes turned to me, the unspoken question hanging in the air. I set my drink down, my resolve hardening. "Things are moving forward," I said. "Helen and I are getting divorced." There were murmurs of surprise, though none of them seemed shocked. I took a deep breath and continued. "Since most of you already know parts of the story, let me clear the air." I pulled out my phone and opened the folder of evidence. "This," I said, holding up the screen, "is what I found. Texts, photos, everything that proves Helen was lying to me for months. If any of you still think she's the victim, you're welcome to read it for yourselves." Rachel, bless her, stepped in to pass my phone around. The room fell silent as people scrolled through the messages, their faces shifting from curiosity to disbelief to outright anger. By the time the phone made its way back to me, the atmosphere had changed. "Wow, one of the guys said, shaking his head. "I can't believe she did this to you, man. That's messed up." "It's worse than I thought," Rachel added, her expression hardening. "She made it sound like you were the bad guy, Mark, like she had no choice." I shrugged, my voice steady. "That's her MO. She's good at spinning stories. But this time, she doesn't get to control the narrative." The group rallied around me after that. People who had been on the fence before were now firmly in my corner, and those who had doubted me apologized. By the end of the night, it felt like a weight had been lifted. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. The fallout from that gathering spread quickly. Within days, word had gotten around to nearly everyone in our social circle. Helen's carefully crafted image of the wronged wife was crumbling fast. James didn't escape the fallout either. Apparently, he'd been playing the same games with other women, and Helen wasn't thrilled to learn she wasn't the only one. A mutual acquaintance, Olivia, filled me in on the details. "They're done," she said, smirking over the phone. She found out he was seeing someone else behind her back. Guess cheaters attract cheaters. Hearing that was a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. Helen had built her house of cards, and now it was collapsing around her. But I wasn't done yet. The final nail in the coffin came when Helen's parents reached out to me directly. Her mother, Linda, wanted to meet, and though I hesitated, I ultimately agreed. We sat down at a quiet diner, the tension between us palpable. "Mark," Linda began, her voice wavering, "I just want to say how sorry I am. For everything. I had no idea Helen was capable of this." I nodded, my throat tight. "I appreciate that, Linda. It means a lot." She sighed, looking down at her hands. "I raised her better than this. I don't know where she went wrong, but she's lost. And I'm so sorry you had to bear the brunt of it." We talked for a while, and by the end of the conversation, I felt a strange sense of closure. Linda and her husband had made it clear they were on my side, and they even offered to testify if the divorce proceedings got messy. By the time I walked out of that diner, I knew Helen's lies were officially dead in the water. She tried to ruin me, but now she was the one standing in the wreckage. The revenge wasn't just about exposing her. It was about reclaiming my life, my story, and my dignity. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was winning. The divorce proceedings began in earnest, and Helen didn't take it well. For all her posturing during the confrontation and her failed attempts to sway public opinion, she hadn't expected me to push forward so decisively. She thought I'd crumble, or at least hesitate, but I didn't. Helen's first move was predictable. She tried to paint herself as the victim. In her response to the divorce filing, she claimed emotional neglect and cited my unreasonable behavior as the reason our marriage had fallen apart. It was laughable, considering the mountain of evidence I'd provided my lawyer. "Let her try," Helen Collins said during our meeting. "My lawyer had a sharp wit and a reputation for being relentless. She's grasping at straws, and the court will see right through it." Helen's claims fell apart almost immediately. The texts and photos made it impossible for her to deny the affair, and her attempts to justify her actions only made her look worse. The judge wasn't buying the sob story she tried to sell. "She's going to lose this battle," Collins told me confidently after our first hearing. "She can't argue against the facts, and she doesn't have the legal grounds to challenge what you're asking for." What I was asking for wasn't unreasonable. I wanted a clean break. No spousal support for Helen, no extended battles over property. We didn't have kids, which simplified things, but Helen wasn't ready to let go without a fight. Her lawyer, a slick, overly confident man named Trevor, tried to push back. He argued that Helen deserved a fair share of our assets, despite the fact that she'd been actively sabotaging our marriage. I almost laughed when he suggested that I should be responsible for maintaining her standard of living. Collins didn't hesitate. She laid out the evidence with surgical precision. The texts, the photos, the timeline of Helen's lies. By the time she finished, even Trevor seemed to realize he was fighting a losing battle. Still, Helen dragged things out. She nitpicked over every detail, from the division of household items to the fate of our joint savings. At one point, she even tried to argue that she should keep the house because she had more sentimental attachment to it. "She's stalling," Collins said after yet another hearing. "It's a common tactic. She's hoping you'll get frustrated and settle for less just to be done with it." But I didn't budge. Every delay, every petty argument only strengthened my resolve. Helen might have thought she could wear me down, but all she was doing was digging herself deeper. The turning point came during a mediation session, where both of us were required to be present. Helen looked exhausted, her once confident demeanor replaced with something closer to desperation. I could tell the cracks were showing. "You've left me with nothing, Mark," she said during a break, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "Are you happy now?" I stared at her, feeling none of the pity she was clearly fishing for. "You left yourself with nothing, Helen," I said calmly. "I'm just making sure the truth comes out." The session ended in my favor. The mediator saw through Helen's tactics and sided with my lawyer's arguments. We walked away with a clear path to finalizing the divorce, leaving Helen and Trevor scrambling to salvage whatever they could. By the time the papers were officially signed, Helen's attempts to manipulate the situation had failed spectacularly. She didn't get the house, she didn't get spousal support, and she didn't get the sympathy she'd been so desperate to win. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. The legal battle was over, and I'd come out stronger. Helen thought she could control the narrative, twist reality to suit her needs. But the truth had prevailed, and now I was free. I walked out of the courthouse that day with my head held high, ready to leave Helen and everything she represented behind for good. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.